Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and hello to everybody tuning in virtually. I'm really thrilled that this year's Strategic Ark has an Arctic panel, Arctic discussion. So for about the next 57, 56 minutes, we are going to transform the Strategic Ark into a strategic icebreaker to talk about Arctic issues. As mentioned, my name is Paweł Markiewicz. I head the Washington, D.C. office of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, but I also, along with several of my colleagues at the Institute, look at the Arctic, focus on the Arctic in our research. So this discussion is all the more near and dear to me when it comes to the topic in question. Beforehand, we kind of had a short discussion with my panelists, and I think we're just going to kick it right off here. So the first kind of opening salvo that I'd like for all of you to begin with is to give your kind of opening remarks / assessment when it comes to, is the Arctic in fact a new or a renewed theater of geopolitical competition? So maybe we'll start with Ryan, Kari, and then we'll go to Michał in the middle.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. I can start this off by saying that, in my opinion, right. And first, I gotta say that as a federal employee of the U.S. Department of Defense, I'm here and speaking in my personal capacity. I in no way represent the official position of the U.S. Department of Defense, as long as everybody's clear on that with my remarks. The region has been, in many ways, a theater of geopolitical competition. It has existed that way for quite some time. We can look at all the indicators of what competition actually means, and we look back in history, and it really has been a competitive environment for quite some time. I think it's a mischaracterization to say that maybe it's renewed, because it always has been that way. However, we have this high north, low tension mantra that we keep referring to, Arctic exceptionalism and so forth. And if you look at the research, you look at some of the folks that have engaged in this region, right? This is a misnomer. It's a misnomer to characterize the Arctic as a region of exceptionalism. It has avoided conflict successfully. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a competitive environment. We can look at this. There's competing claims, right? We have several commercial interests that are now expanding, overlapping, and evolving into a competitive sort of environment with resource competition, right? There's competing claims with regard to where some of the ridges are, right? In the exclusive economic zone claims and so forth, right? So this is certainly a competitive environment for the international, or on the international stage. It is also an environment that has been, I'd say, relatively isolated from the resulting military competition and the military conflict that we've seen in other regions of the world that have stemmed from very similar indicators of competition that have led to conflict. And so it has been maybe a different environment, although it hasn't been isolated from competition in any way, shape, or form. I think we're just seeing more and more attention drawn toward it now. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Kari, your thoughts, new or renewed?
Well, I would say, of course, both. So I would agree with Ryan on this. I mean, we know, I'm a historian in basis, so we know Arctic competition, great power competition from the Cold War, of course. It's been an important theater for competition for decades. But seen from the Nordics, including Norway, I would say it's a new theater also. 2 days ago, or perhaps 3 days ago, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense announced that Norway is, and I would say finally, easing up on its self-imposed restrictions on Allied military exercises and presence in the northeasternmost part of Norway, so the immediate border region with Russia. And this is historical for Norway. These self-imposed restrictions came from the very beginning, the founding of NATO, where Norway was a founding member. And they have been crucial to Norway. Norway has been conducting this policy all through the Cold War and into the post-Soviet period of deterrence towards Russia through its NATO membership, but at the same time also reassuring Russia. And this policy of reassurance is now eased up. So Norway is realizing, that military capacities and force is the way to handle Russia. And this is really big, but it's sort of also been coming since, of course, Sweden's and Finland's accession to NATO, which I mean, for logical reasons, Norway can no longer be the only Nordic state which does not allow for allied military presence and training.
Great, thank you. Michał, your thoughts. Is the Arctic, or do you see the Arctic as an area of new or renewed geopolitical competition?
First of all, thank you for having me here. This is a marvelous place, and I'm happy to discuss Arctic issues in Warsaw, because it's sometimes not very popular topic in Polish geopolitical debate. Answering to your question, I think that similarly to Kari and Ryan, I would say a little both, because in my opinion, what we face today is a rather new geopolitical global confrontation, reshaping international order. At the same time, Arctic was or has been an arena of different conflict, geopolitical conflicts in the past, in the modern times. If we think about, for example, conflict between indigenous and non-indigenous perspectives for many centuries. We think about access to resources, living resources of ocean, Arctic oceans, even 300 years ago. These were also some kind of conflicts. In terms of geopolitical conflicts, we can say something about 20th century situation. And I would say that nowadays we face some kind of refiguration of this situation, coming new non-Arctic states coming to the area. So if we think in terms of actorness, we think about what is the purpose of this conflict? And if we think about measures which can be employed, I would say that this is something rather new. Thank you.
So I want to maybe dig deeper, kind of peel away the layers of the onion to get a little more into this this question, this discussion, the region. So maybe Ryan, again to you. From the U.S. perspective, how does it plan to compete in the Arctic? Cooperate, compete. We've seen a whole slew of strategic documents coming from the various branches of the U.S. militaries, these Arctic policies, strategies. Is it kind of a go-it-alone type of strategy in the U.S. mindset, or one based on cooperation with the regional partners, whether it's Canada, North America, Greenland/Denmark, and the European partners? How do you assess that?
The short answer is who the hell knows. The reality, I mean, there's a lot going on right now in the United States, as we well know. I can answer with some context from the previous administration, in that if you look at the previous administration, the Biden administration's Arctic strategy, it advanced a protect, promote, and preserve model, right, by way of the U.S. approach to the Arctic in general. This is from a military perspective, generally speaking, geopolitically, diplomatically, and so forth, but principally militarily, protect, promote, and preserve was the sort of the framework, right? The Trump administration hasn't yet released a new Arctic strategy. They certainly will at some point. And my sense of it is, I have this is a Ryan perspective, not a U.S. government perspective. My sense is that it's going to adopt more of let's say, an interests, an investment, maybe even an ideological sort of approach rather than protect, promote, and preserve. And I think we're going to see a lot of this America First sort of rhetoric and dialogue that comes in. And you hear peace through strength as a common axiom coming out of the White House right now, and especially out of the Pentagon as well with Secretary Hegseth, right? This idea of peace through strength, and how will then the U.S. approach within that framework is yet to be determined. I do believe that the U.S., at least from a military perspective, will continue to, hopefully anyway, continue to rely on and absorb knowledge, institutionalized knowledge, and regional knowledge from partners and allies in the region. If you look back at this video that we started with, a lot of that stuff, the military training in the Arctic environment and doing Arctic maneuvers and so forth in the cold weather and extreme cold, is something that the U.S. military, I'm a veteran Marine officer, right? I can tell you flat out that the U.S. military does not have the institutionalized knowledge to operationalize much of what we say in the Arctic strategies that you mentioned. We talked about this the other day. The Army's Arctic strategy says regain Arctic dominance. In order to regain something, you needed to have had it before, right? We have never dominated the Arctic. And so the simple title of that is a ridiculous title, and it's indicative. And we can go down the examples of all the other problems with all the various Arctic strategies in the U.S., but it's broadly indicative of the collective hubris and ignorance that the United States has with regard to this region. The vast majority of that stuff that you saw in that video, most of our policy and strategy makers have no idea what it's like. They have no idea what it's like to have your eyeballs freeze shut in negative 40 degrees, right? They simply don't. And unless or until we have policymakers and strategists that are engaging in this environment and know what it's like to live and operate and work in negative 40, in the dark, 24/7, and things like this, we are going to continue to have these ignorant policies. And I don't frankly know what the United States will do. Again, I think it's going to be much more about personal or direct interest rather than this idea of protecting, promoting, and preserving like it was. But we're certainly going to see a change. I think it will be much more self-serving than it has been. However, I hope and I believe that the U.S., at least the military, will continue to work with the likes of Norway and Sweden and Finland specifically in our continued Arctic training. Hopefully, we'll see.
So could we maybe then make the hypothesis that it might be very North American Arctic focused rather than broad Arctic?
Fair assessment. The other thing, too, that I didn't mention, that you bring this up, is the U.S. is certainly not making any friends right now in Ottawa, if we're following the relations there. And Canada had been our biggest, literally and figuratively, our biggest Arctic ally and partner over the course of many decades. And I certainly see some antagonistic approaches now coming out of Washington, at least pointed north. So I think it'll be much more of a, maybe not so much a North American focus, but it's certainly going to be a U.S. focused. However, several of my colleagues in Alaska, I'm an affiliate professor up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Center for Arctic Security and Resilience, and I can tell you, I go up there all the time, and they feel like they're being cut off and sidelined. Alaska, in many ways, feels irrelevant in the Arctic conversation, and yet it's the only Arctic coastline that the United States actually has. So there's a lot that's going to happen. I think that we're going to see some evolving interests or evolving investments in certainly our infrastructure, but icebreakers specifically, the Trump administration has constantly talked about, and they did in the previous administration, talked about investing in icebreakers. The Polar Security Cutter program is coming out. It is already out. We're going to wait and see how long it actually takes to construct some of these vessels. They're saying mid to late 2020s. I don't buy it. I think it'll be probably 2030 at the earliest before we even see one fielded. But that's yet to be determined. We'll see what happens.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I want to shift to Europe now. So Norway, Kari. The Norwegian perspective, we talked about this, you mentioned this backstage before we came out. Norway borders Russia. Russia, of course, is the biggest Arctic actor for Russia, the Arctic, the Northern Sea route, developing the resources. It's bread and butter almost. It's window to the world, it's global window. Based off of your professional experience, what is the Norwegian perception when it comes to Russia in the Arctic as well as China in the Arctic? And how has Russia in particular navigated this new situation that we're kind of hinting at following its attack on Ukraine in 2022 in the Arctic?
Well, you're asking both about Norway and Russia, so I'll do both. When it comes to Russia, I mean, Russia is the biggest Arctic state, right, in terms of territories. And during Vladimir Putin, I would say the Arctic has been hyped a lot as the Russian region that really shows that Russia is a great power, you know, Russia, because of these territories, because of all the resources. So this is very much part of the Kremlin's narrative about being a great power. It has to do with the Arctic. It's important to Russian identity and self-perception as a great power in the world. On the other hand, it's a fact that Russia cannot develop the Arctic alone. And this has been true throughout history. So for the post-Soviet period, what Russia has been doing is very much inviting Western partners, NATO partners, into its Arctic to cooperate on oil and gas and all kinds of extractivism, and most of this has failed, I would say. No big oil and gas projects with Norway, for example. But since 2014, and in particular since 2022, the pivot towards Asia has been great in Russian Arctic policy. So they're very much relying on China now, which we will come back to, I guess. And India benefits a lot from buying cheap Russian oil. This whole reconfiguration of how the Arctic works in terms of governance and cooperation is big. And I think we are way past these ideas of high north, low tensions, and being able to actually cooperate. I think we're seeing a very clearly divided Arctic. We're seeing the NATO Arctic, and then we have Russia's Arctic, backed very concretely by China as a near Arctic state. And it's really also interesting, if we remember back, Russia was very negative to China seeking this status as a near Arctic state in the Arctic Council, if we go 15, 18 years back in time, because Russia knows that she will depend on China in Arctic issues. Since the tensions between Russia and the Western states have been growing in the Arctic, Russia changed its position and has been welcoming China very much into the Arctic. So we're seeing a whole new reconfiguration. This is also part of the new great power competition in the Arctic, of course, that it's actually dividing in a way reminding us of the Cold War in many ways. As for Norway, Norway has for long been cautious, I said, very much complying with Russian Arctic policies and very much open to Russian pressure, I would say. And even if we now are changing our defense policies in military terms, I think we still have, in the Norwegian public, we have a long way to go in terms of Russia's psychological warfare and these more hybrid actions that we're seeing. I mean, Russia is not posing openly as an aggressor in the Arctic. This is probably because it doesn't serve Russia's interests in the Arctic. But we have seen in Norway, in Sweden and Finland in particular, when they were waiting for the NATO membership, we've seen an increasing amount of hybrid operations. These are difficult to attribute, of course, so we cannot say for sure that this is Russia, but Russia has an interest in harassing, manipulating, disturbing the Nordic states in the northern regions. So we've seen a lot of this over the last 3 years.
A lot of below the threshold, kind of.
Below the threshold, kind of. We saw the cutting of one of the two mainland Svalbard cables, which is vital, of course, to the Norwegian community in Svalbard. And we've seen a lot of this in the Baltic Sea, cutting of seabed cables. What I've been studying lately is Russian memory policy. So the Kremlin's memory policy and how this also spreads to the Arctic. We've seen it in Kirkenes, which is the Norwegian town bordering Russia, because we have a Russian general consulate who are very eager to celebrate May 9 and all kinds of dates in the Russian military calendar. And since 2022, we've seen this also in Svalbard, actually, because Svalbard has a small Russian population. Russia is not big in Svalbard in terms of economics, and the population is very low. But all kinds of low-cost, cost-efficient hybrid operations like staging, orchestrating May 9 parades, Immortal Regiment parades, celebrating Russian Navy Day with military mock parades in Svalbard waters. All these kinds of things have become regular, actually, in Svalbard over the last 3 years. And it's quite worrying, I would say.
So then let me ask just one more follow-up question onto that. How does Norway react to that when it sees these types of manifestations, the activity of the Russian minority in those parts of the country? What is the reaction of the Norwegian government, and what do they try to do maybe to address that without obviously playing into some other things?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, these things are difficult to handle, of course. Gray zone provocations who are strategically making use of Norway's freedom of speech, freedom of symbols, freedom of expression. The Immortal Regiment parades, the Victory Day parades in Svalbard are within the law. But they're militaristic, revanchist, neo-imperialist shows. They're very propagandistic. The first way of handling this in 2022-23 from Norway's Ministry of Justice and the governor in Svalbard was to overlook it, keep it calm. Then all of a sudden, a Russian bishop visited Pyramiden, which is the Russian ghost town in Svalbard, inaugurating and sprinkling with holy water this 7-meter-high Russian Orthodox cross, which was erected right outside of the property of Russia. Russia has some property on Svalbard. So it was deliberately, they were digging into soil where they knew that the governor of Svalbard and the Norwegian Ministry of Justice had to react because they were violating the Svalbard Environmental Act. So they sort of provoked a reaction from Norway. So Norway is working on how to react, trying to be diplomatic, not to allow for Russian accusations of Norway being Russophobic or Norway discriminating against Russia. So the cross is still there, but it's moved into Pyramiden, where they can actually dig and make a fundament for a cross. So Norway is pretty diplomatic, I would say.
Okay. Ryan, I want to turn to you one more time, and then we're going to go to Michał in 1 second. Building up on Russia and the Arctic, how do you see U.S. relations playing out with Russia in the Arctic? I know that during some of the discussions that have been going around with the possible, again, Trump reset with Russia, that cooperation in the Arctic is an element of that or could be an element of that. There is scientific cooperation between most of the Arctic sides, including Russia, but here we're talking about political and not only. So how do you see kind of the future of that cooperation panning out between those two great powers? And then if you want to kind of tack China into your conversation as well, it would be interesting to hear what you have to say as well, too.
I think we're going to see I hesitate even saying this, but I really do see the indicators of this. I think we're going to see a more pro-Russia approach, not necessarily one that appeases Russia in any way, shape, or form, but relative to past years, and even the Trump 1.0 administration, I think we are going to see in this Trump 2.0, the second term, a much more pro-Russia approach, right? And we've seen some of these dynamics coming back out with Putin and Trump. This relationship and this dialogue is well covered. So I think we're going to see, again, a much more favorable approach to dealing with Russia, relating to Russia. The fundamental challenge that the United States has right now is that we still have on the books, and we had since 2015, a law that prohibits bilateral to military cooperation. And this is you can look up the National Defense Authorization Act from FY 2015, I believe, is when we codified it. And every administration, every year since, has continued to maintain this law on the books. And it literally prohibits bilateral military cooperation with the Russian Federation. So anything from the United States, the federal government, and any of our funds cannot be used to support cooperation with the Russian Federation in any way, shape, or form. Doing diplomatic type stuff is separate. It doesn't prohibit diplomatic efforts and so forth, but that is nonetheless a fundamental obstacle to engaging with Russia if we wanted to have a much more, again, a favorable approach or a more supportive approach. These legal obstacles, these administrative obstacles still present challenges. So I actually wrote an article a couple of months ago that advocated for revisiting some of these things and maybe potentially if you don't like the law, then change it, right? Having a much more pragmatic conversation, a much more pragmatic approach to advancing U.S. interests, which I think we are going to see and we are seeing, relative to China, however, given that I think that the United States is going to take a more pro-Russia approach, or certainly going to take an anti-China approach. We've definitely seen that. If you look at some of the appointments within the Trump administration, especially in the DOD, and you look at some of the folks that have been appointed to some of these high-level policy and strategy positions that are presiding over now the apparatus that is the Department of Defense in the U.S., most of these folks are China hawks. They are absolute China watchers, China hawks, and they say China is the #1 problem globally, geopolitically, diplomatically, militarily, you name it. And so it's not necessarily that we are dismissing Russia in any way, shape, or form, but from the U.S. perspective, but we are just focusing more so on China. And we're seeing China, all these dual-use activities in the Arctic, and the U.S. is absolutely watching this, absolutely, and tracking it by way of a threat. I don't necessarily know that we've assessed that China poses a direct threat in the Arctic yet. However, we're certainly watching much of the dual-use activity that's coming out of the research vessels and many of the icebreakers that China has sent up, or at least one of them we track specifically. And we're looking at a lot of that, and we're looking at the evolving Chinese influence and expansion efforts in the Arctic, and certainly watching as a potential area of concern. However, it hasn't quite boiled over to that point yet. So,
thanks, Ryan. Michał, I want to pull you in now to this conversation. With your unique background when it comes to the Polish perspective and your work in helping shape some of the strategic documents that came out in relation to Poland's position in the Arctic, as well as the Antarctic, the polar position. So Poland is obviously a longtime stakeholder in the Arctic. Since 1998, it's been part of the Arctic Council. How does Poland view the political dynamics in the region and kind of the social and ecological aspects that are going on?
Well, it's not so short story, because we started to be involved in the Arctic through science in the 1930s. So we are to some extent a guest in the Arctic for almost 100 years. And this is mostly based on science and research. And to be honest, this research is mostly conducted in Svalbard. So our perspective on Arctic is not pan-Arctic, it's rather European Arctic. So this is the first thing I would like to stress. And actually it's true, Poland has issued its Polish polar policy, in 2020, in a very difficult moment just before pandemic started. So its implementation is not fully advanced, I would say. However, as a average strategic document, this document also has some very general goals. And I would say that Poland definitely should do whatever is possible to achieve the goals, because they are very constructive. Poland is in favor of peaceful cooperation in dialogue with indigenous peoples, is in favor of science-based governance system, which is mostly Arctic Council activities. So I would say that we, Poland, would like to see continuation of the current system, because the system is open for non-Arctic participants, non-Arctic stakeholders. And the situation will change with aggression of Russia on Ukraine definitely threatened this system from Polish perspective, because Arctic Council was paused and programs were just stopped. And the possibility to develop this cooperation is not obvious nowadays. And I think probably like many other states, we are waiting for specific decisions of Trump administration, how this country going to approach Arctic collaboration, how they will be engaged in Arctic Council, whether they will follow some patterns or just ignore this institution, this forum. So I would say that we try to monitor the situation. We hope for the best. We also try to communicate with like-minded non-Arctic partners and Arctic partners, which share our hopes, I would say. So actually, we are too small to make a difference, even if we hold something like what is called Warsaw format meetings for non-Arctic states since 10 years. This is just a side event for Arctic, non-Arctic stakeholders. we are not the main player here, so we need just to observe and adjust.
Kari, I know you wanted to.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly follow up because Norway very much sympathizes and shares this perspective on an Arctic Council and the important work that the Council has been doing on Arctic environment, climate policies and indigenous issues as under threat. And this is why Norway spent its chairship for 2 years, which was finished recently, a few weeks ago, spent its chairship on trying to make sure that the Arctic Council survived. And it did, in the sense that Russia is included on working group level. So the Council somehow still functions with digital meetings, so no in-person meetings to my knowledge at least, and no political representation from the Russian side. And then this is an ambiguous strategy, I would say, and I'm very curious to see how Denmark will continue this policy of Norway, or if they will somehow break with a rather soft approach to Russia, because what we also have seen is that Russia has been very actively messaging all throughout Norway's chairship to make sure that she was not totally excluded from the Arctic Council. And this is, I would say, and this is my opinion, that Russia is not interested in staying in the Arctic Council because she intends to spend a lot of political efforts on environmental issues. It has to do with influence. So Russia cannot face, or the Kremlin does not want to face a situation where they, as the Arctic great power, are not part of the important Arctic Council. So they need the seat for influence, I would say. And we know that, for example, the indigenous representation in the Arctic Council is totally controlled by the Kremlin. It was co-opted in 2012, the Raipon, so the umbrella Russian Indigenous Peoples Organization, whereas the oppositional indigenous groups are in exile. They're outside of Russia now, and they're trying to establish their own structures and working for true indigenous rights, not the Kremlin's version of indigenous rights. So the whole Arctic Council issue is very complex. I mean, I believe all Western states, and I hope also the US, wants the Council to survive, because it's doing really important work, which is obstructed by this awful warfare that Russia is conducting. But it's not a given that we can continue to include Russia in the Council, I would say.
I think those are very interesting points when it comes to the future of this governance structure that's been over the Arctic for so long. I want to turn back to Michał for a quick second. When it comes to Poland's priorities Arctic-wise, what would you say would be, in your opinion, the top 2 or 3 that you mentioned? There are some points in the strategic documents that Poland's put out that are good and that it should achieve or work towards achieving. What would you say those points should be?
Well, I think that definitely, even if we talk a lot about the geopolitical things, we cannot forget about climate change. And it was the main topic in the Arctic discussions for more than decades, and it just not disappeared. And from Poland's perspective, research on climate change are essential contribution we can bring to the table. So we do hope to continue this in collaboration with partners, particularly from Norway, from Canada, other Nordic states. I also would like to have North American partners from the United States. So we are open for this kind of collaboration, but at the same time we are aware that the Arctic is slowly getting closed to some extent for security reasons. So this is first thing we should consider. Secondly, I think that what we could do is offer much more collaboration on bilateral relations. Arctic hasn't been prioritized in these relations too much, And I think it is something we can offer, referring to our business opportunities, for example, to people from Poland being engaged in different forms in different Arctic states. I think about Iceland, for example, in Polish migration in this country. So there's a lot of things we can discuss with our partners. And the last, probably very domestic challenge is to make Arctic much more important in the political agenda. And I think it is something we strongly should do, because I think that a lot of important things is taking place in this region. And building on what just Kari said, it would be hard to imagine collaboration in the Arctic Council, listening while President of the United States is threatening to Denmark about Greenland, or is having some things to Canada, which are also long-standing partners. So this kind of discussion really need to be somehow resolved in the near future, because time is not taking in our, I would say, for good sake of our Arctic, right? Climate change is not waiting for our decisions. It's progressing. So let's do it quickly as much as possible. Thank you.
Great. Before we turn over to questions and take some questions from our audience, which I hope we'll have plenty of before lunch, I would like to mention as well. I might just ask one more overarching question to all three in relation to the question of the future of the Arctic Council. So Ryan, I'd like you to chime in, kind of maybe again, forecast, if you can, the US view when it comes to that. How engaged will it be, might it be? And then also the China question, right? China's position in the Arctic. From the Norwegian perspective, how does Poland see that as well? Productive, counterproductive, indifferent? So maybe if we could just handle that topic, and then we'll turn over and take some questions from the audience.
U.S. perspective on the Arctic Council with regard to Russia in particular. We know if you're following the Arctic in general, you know what happened with since the invasion in 2022. Most of, if not all, and the U.S. did to a point, but the other seven members of the Arctic Council basically cut off relations with Russia. Now we've normalized some of this back. We've brought some of these relationships back, and Kari mentioned some of the activities that have been happening and bringing Russia back into some of the working groups and so forth. But Russia was the chair of the Arctic Council from 21 to 2023, and the other Arctic Council members cut off relations with them. So you had effectively a non-functioning diplomatic forum, right? And in many ways, it was counterproductive to trying to, again, not trying to appease Russia by any stretch, but it was counterproductive to trying to maintain some sort of diplomatic relation with this country when you cut off the last functioning diplomatic forum and you cut the country off from every point of dialogue possible. Who knows, right? You've got, then that's the recipe for misunderstanding, miscalculation, escalation, all sorts of other things that we can get in and engage with the hyperbolic rhetoric, right? But this is part of the risk when you cut these relationships off. So as far as the United States is concerned, again, I can't tell you what the Trump administration will do. My sense of it is that, I mentioned before, the administration will take a much more pro-Russia approach, a pragmatic approach to, again, foot stomp and emphasize that point. I think that's really where the U.S. will go with regard to its relations with Russia. I do believe that we're going to see an advancement within the Arctic Council, using that as the existing forum to try to, I'll use the term again, normalize relations to the extent that we can, understanding that it's a very fine line to walk so that we are not perceived as appeasing this country, which is an international belligerent, right? So there's a lot of delicate type stuff that the U.S. has to navigate here, also so as to not effectively, excuse the language, but piss off our partners and our allies in NATO, right? And there's a lot of nuance to that as well. So I think there's going to be, we will certainly see a different approach with the Trump administration, a departure from the previous norm, both in the first administration and the Biden administration. Certainly, we're going to see a much more, positive and or pragmatic approach to at least dealing with Russia by, with, and through the Arctic Council. And then, again, I'll emphasize the point that I already made, that the U.S. will probably do everything it can to box out, block out, deter, and or deny China access and expansion as much as it's trying to, right? The U.S. will do whatever it can, is my sense, to try to deny China those opportunities in the Arctic. So we certainly see China as much more of a concern than we do Russia. We know that Russia's primary concern in the Arctic is maintaining economic access, right? And that's, the United States is not going to try to antagonize Russia when it simply views it as a country that's just trying to maintain its access to its own resources. So.
Great, thank you, Kari. China, Norway, Arctic, how do you see it?
These are truly interesting times. I mean, how the U.S. will navigate the Sino-Russian relations, which are strengthened. They're strengthening and they're growing day by day in the Arctic. Yeah, it will be interesting to follow that. As for Norway, I mean, Norway is very set on, as a small state and with huge Arctic territories and waters, we are very set on in every way setting the stage for true international cooperation on scientific research in the Arctic, on climate change, on all these important issues. And as for China, there was a big delegation with our Prime Minister in China last year, only a few months ago, with ministers and businesses. And so Norway is very open to China's arguments that China's key interest in the Arctic is the environment and understanding climate change, because this is vital to all the huge Chinese cities on the eastern coast, right? They will be affected gravely by higher sea levels and all kinds of climate change. So Norway really wants to believe that this is China's primary agenda. This is my interpretation. And Norway is very much including China as a near-Arctic state, very positive to China in the Arctic Council. On the other hand, we've seen a few instances of Sino-Russian cooperation, which are really worrying to Norway. You know, military drills in Arctic seas, far from Norway, that is, but still the Chinese Coast Guard was all of a sudden signing an agreement of cooperation with the Russian Coast Guard, which would affect Norway's sea border with Russia directly in the Barents Sea, potentially. And we've also seen some minor Chinese, we don't know what it is, hybrid operations or whatever in Svalbard, similar of what Russia has been conducting. So Norway is becoming more aware of China also as a potential threat due to the strong bond with Russia in the Arctic, I would say.
And Michał, if you could kind of tickle that question a little bit as well, from one non-Arctic state looking at another non-Arctic state, how is Poland's perception of China in the Arctic, India in the Arctic, some of those other countries?
Well, I think that it's interesting to see some kind of trajectory in the development of non-Arctic states, observers to the Arctic Council, how our policy has been evolving since probably more than a decade. I remember once it was in Reykjavik during Arctic Circle conferences, somebody said, probably it was President Grimson, who said that Arctic is open for everyone who is respecting Arctic rules, house of the rules of the house. And now I'm thinking whether it is still true, whether the Arctic states are following these rules. And I have some objections for this. So it is difficult to judge non-Arctic observers whether they follow or not follow these rules. And definitely the group is very diverse with different India, China, Japan, with different interests comparing to European observers. So I think that is difficult to say what is a common ground for all these countries at this moment. I think that they should probably keep their finger crossed for stability and peace in the Arctic. But probably this is not the best moment to advance their own interests, because it can bring a risk of a conflict between Arctic and non-Arctic states, which is now maybe hard to imagine from the perspective you just mentioned about the Russia and China collaboration. But we know that this collaboration also has its limits. So in maybe future, the fragmentation or reorientation will have different shapes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to the audience now. I see a few hands, so we'll go to the gentleman here, and then we'll go on this side. The gentleman and lady in the back.
Thank you. Yes, Tomasz Łukaszuk, University of Warsaw, expert on maritime governance. Speaking about Arctic Council, so if three of you are aware of some joint actions of Russia and China, and probably Arctic Council is no longer only about environment, so what's your perspective on turning Arctic Council on something about trade and also security? Thank you.
Okay, we'll collect a few and then we can bounce back. Kinga in the back had a question as well, and then we'll jump to this side. Yes.
Kinga Dudzińska, Polish Institute of International Affairs. So I would like to ask at least all panelists in practice, so about the priorities in Arctic. We've got actually the non-Arctic states which are focusing on the strategic point of view regarding US, Russia and China, watching Arctic not necessary as non-Arctic states. So as Kari mentioned, Norway and minority indigenous people, for example, policy which will focus and the main problem in the Arctic Council, for example, and the soft power using an Arctic Council at least till now. So having the point of strategy of global and those Arctic states, what is the priority at the moment, and how to deal in practice or not deal with Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Justyna in the first row, and then we'll go to the two hands in the back as well.
Thanks, Paweł. Justyna Łuszczuk, the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I have a question about China's presence in the Arctic, because for me, I'm not very clear, but I would like to ask you, to which extent China is present and active in this region? Is China a new kid on the block, or maybe China has been present and active for years? Because, you know, I'm asking the question, but I remember that many, many years ago, there was a kind of a myth that China has been colonizing the Siberia, for example, which was not true. So now I know that Russia is active, and of course, China-Russia cooperation, China is interested in this region. I would like to ask, to some extent, China is already there. Thank you.
We'll go to Balkan, and then Jakub.
Thank you, Balkan Devlan, Canada. Two interrelated questions. One, how do we strengthen the connections between the European High North, European Arctic, and the North American Arctic, given the challenges tend to be slightly different on military and defense? And related to that, how can we think about the connections between Arctic, Nordic, and the Baltic seas, given that major Arctic powers such as Sweden, Denmark, Finland are also major Baltic powers, and Canada, given our presence in Latvia, can be considered a Baltic power. How can we think about that? Thank you.
Good, great.
Jakub the Institute of New Europe. I have a question specifically to Ryan. Today marks 45 days since President Trump signed into law a new executive order titled Restoring America's Maritime Dominance. We all know that it's impossible to restore dominance without real capabilities, and among many things that this executive order mandates is the putting together a comprehensive across the government review of America's shipbuilding capabilities within 45 days. So do you see from your perspective a serious effort ongoing within the administration to meet the criteria or the requirements of this executive order? Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So the bad news is that we have about 8 minutes left, so that gives about 3 minutes per question and a smorgasbord of questions here. The good news is, however, that our panelists will be at lunch, so you can engage them much more. So maybe 3 minutes per, and we'll go in the same order. So Ryan, if you want to start, you can take your pick as to what you want to address from those questions.
I'll address the direct question here with regard to the shipbuilding capabilities. I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell that the U.S. meets that timeline or deadline, and frankly don't see a reality where the U.S. meets any or all of the mandates in that executive order by way of, and we certainly have the intent, there's no question about that, right? But whether we can actually do provide those reports first and foremost, right, is going to be a challenge. And secondly, can we meet those mandates? I don't see it happening. We go back to the Coast Guard Polar Security Cutter Program and some of the other things. There was an executive order, I believe in 2020, don't quote me on the exact date, but I believe it was July of 2020 that President Trump signed mandating a full and comprehensive review of icebreaker capabilities, right? And he actually wrote about weaponizing and putting armament on research vessels, on icebreakers, and made a proclamation basically that we should establish a new icebreaker program, and we need to modernize, we need to invest in all sorts of other stuff, and essentially nothing came from that, right? And so we have this, we've got the Polar Security Cutter program that's been authorized, but again, we just don't see it advancing the way it should by way of the initial timelines and projections. So I'm a pessimist when it comes to some of this stuff. I've lived and worked in the United States government for 20 years in various capacities, both in and out of uniform, and the bureaucracy is intractable in so many ways. So I just don't see a whole hell of a lot of progress happening on that front. That's a pessimistic view, admittedly, but that is my perspective. I'll note the question about the Arctic Council with regard to the security potential for a security mandate. Again, not a snowball's chance in hell is my sense. The Arctic Council has fundamentally rejected the idea of discussing security and militarization of any kind within its forums, and I believe it will continue to maintain that opposition to anything with regard to security, and we can debate whether that's prudent or not. I've got my own opinions on that, but that is nonetheless the reality. I think the Arctic Council will be steadfast in its resistance to adopting a security mandate of any kind.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Kari, go ahead, take your pick.
Yeah, since we have little time, I'll just say that I agree with everything Ryan said on the Arctic Council and security. This is my view as well. We are all sorry that this is the situation, of course, but I think it's true that the Arctic Council has outplayed its role in a certain sense, and that the big security issues is not on its agenda, and they do not want it on the agenda. So they are sidelined by the growing security tensions and the spillover to Arctic affairs as well. As for China's presence in the Arctic, it's limited still, but Russia is very much inviting China into investing in the Northern Sea route, which has been a giant prestige project for the Kremlin for years. I mean, it was a prestige project for Stalin in its original form. But it's costly, so Russia is doing its utmost to attract Chinese investments in port facilities, in all kinds of infrastructure with the Northern Sea route. We know, of course, that China is also interested in another sea route, which would navigate the international waters across the really central Arctic basin. Once this opens up, or it's technically and economically viable to navigate these waters. So China's Arctic agenda is not the same as Russia's Arctic agenda, of course, but Russia is doing its job attracting China to the Arctic and using its huge Arctic territories for what they're worth to build cooperation with China. China is present on Svalbard, very concretely. They have a research station in Ny-Ålesund, which is the Norwegian science village in Svalbard, where Norway facilitates all signatory states to the Svalbard Treaty who would like to do natural science research with Svalbard as a platform. Russia has launched, or Arctic Oil, the Russian state mining company in Svalbard, has been launching these plans for its own research complex in Barentsburg or perhaps Pyramiden, we don't know. And Russia really wants China to be part of this new BRICS based research center. So Russia wants to establish its own international research center with friendly states, of course competing with Norway as the one who is has sovereignty over Svalbard, also in terms of research. So this is another rather sensitive issue for Norway, China's presence on Svalbard. So we will be curious to see how this all develops.
Great. Michał, please go ahead. Take your pick.
On China in the Arctic, I just would like to add that China has a very long-standing polar experience, because this is not only Arctic but also Antarctic. So this is something not new for China to have this experience, and I would say even ambitious related with the polar regions in general. Referring to the question about Arctic Council perspective to reshape its construction, I agree with Ryan. I also have some arguments why it is not so easy, because we had something like Arctic Economic Council, we have Arctic Coast Guard Forum for a couple of years. These bodies didn't make any specific career, they didn't have any specific achievements or accomplishments. So I would say that so far it was not possible to find these elements which would be good ground or foundation for this kind of development. And this refers also to the question about the strengthening connection between European and North American perspective or interests. I would say that natural bridge would be Greenland, but I don't have idea at this moment what to advise and to whom actually. So I just hope that the sovereignty rights will be respected. But definitely it would be something what can bridge partners from different countries. But as far as we know, these resources which are expected to be found or are identified have a strategic meaning for all partners, so nobody is willing to share. So this is the problem, that now we have a lot of egoistic interests in the Arctic, and this prevents collaboration, which is always based on the trust. And I think that we lost this trust 3 years ago. And how to create it again, and there will be a challenge for probably next generations. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Michał. Ryan, Kari, Michał, we've successfully navigated some of the uncharted Arctic waters. So please give my colleagues a round of applause for their inputs, for the very interesting discussion. And I hope that we can continue these Arctic discussions here in Warsaw. So thank you.
Paweł, please join us here for a quick overview of the discussion. That was very interesting. So the Arctic may seem like a deserted and cold place, but it is important for the international relations nevertheless. From the conversation you moderated, we can see that the stakes are high. What are they exactly?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's the economic development, the opportunities that are there. It's power projection and influence for a lot of countries, or maintaining that influence for someone like Russia, as we heard so much, or you know, getting on board in what's available there, kind of what China wants to do. So there's a whole slew of things involved geopolitically when it comes to the region, and I'm happy that these points were made by our colleagues.
Excellent. Thank you, Paweł, for this excellent moderation.